Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Bruce Friedrich, the founder and president of the Y Combinator-backed Good Food Institute, a global network of nonprofit organizations with the aim of advancing alternative protein policy, science, and corporate engagement. Bruce is featured on the likes of CNN and CNBC, has penned op-eds for the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, among several other notable publications. His 2019 TED Talk has been viewed more than 2.3 million times and translated into 30 different languages. As a trailblazer in the alternative protein space, his expertise as the president of the Good Food Institute and co-founder of New Crop Capital would shed light on our discussion, WES perspectives on the global food system. Bruce, thank you for being here with me. Why don't we first begin with your journey founding GFI and New Crop Capital?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, Vivek. I'm delighted to be here having this conversation with you. So I started the Good Food Institute and New Crop Capital, basically inspired by the companies Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, and Hampton Creek, now called Eat Just. And the basic observation is that we're going to have 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. Animal agriculture is already responsible for about a fifth of direct emissions climate change. It already uses 3 billion hectares of land. So that's the size of China plus India times 2 plus Indonesia. It already uses 70% of medically relevant antibiotics are fed to farm animals rather than used to treat human illness. And the list goes on. And every single prediction of what animal agriculture is going to look like between now and 2050 predicts that it will go up precipitously. So the lowest prediction is 62% more meat, dairy, and eggs by 2050. The highest prediction is 350% of current levels. Most of the predictions hover at about double. That will preclude the world from meeting its Paris Climate Agreement goals. It will make it impossible to meet deforestation goals. It will make it impossible to meet methane pledge goals. It could cause another pandemic. It could make antibiotics no longer work in human medicine. It's a lot of really bad stuff, but we are not going to convince people by sheer force of education to change their diets. But what we can do is change those products. We can give people the exact same meat, dairy, and eggs that they love, the exact same culinary experience, but eliminating the contribution to antimicrobial resistance and pandemic risk, slashing the land use needs, slashing the direct emissions. So we call it alternative proteins. So making something indistinguishable from animal meat out of plants, or making something that is literally indistinguishable. It's the exact same product, but using cell cultivation instead of live animals. So that's what GFI works on.
Right. Yeah, that's fantastic, Bruce. And thank you also for setting the context of what alternative proteins are, as I think many students as well as professionals in this space are not so familiar as to the role of alternative proteins. And I think this segues quite well into the topic of food sovereignty and food security. UNFAO recently predicted a 14% increase in global meat consumption by the year 2030. And as we continue to witness shortages, some due to extreme weather events, which are obviously detrimental to the continuation of outdoor farming, as well as others due to grain shortages due to the war in Ukraine, what do you think the role of alternative proteins would be in meeting this growing nutrition demand?
Yeah, so GFI was set up. I started working on it in 2015, and the basic idea was how do we feed close to 10 billion people by 2050 without burning the planet to a crisp? So half of that is food security, and the other half of that is climate change. It takes about 9 calories of animal feed to get 1 calorie back out in the form of chicken. It takes about 40 calories of animal feed to get 1 calorie back out in the form of beef. In both cases, those are World Resources Institute numbers. And what that means is that vast quantities of corn, soy, wheat, alfalfa, other animal feed crops are essentially wasted in being burned off by animals, the animal physiology. So probably everybody listening to us right now is concerned about food waste. And we should be concerned about food waste. Something on the order of 40% of all of the food that is produced globally is wasted, food loss and waste. And yet, just in the physiology of the chicken, you have literally 800% of the calories that are fed to the chicken go away. It takes 9 calories to a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. We may not be throwing, that wheat, corn, soy, et cetera, away personally, but that's the relationship that we enter into. And it's 40 calories into a cow to get 1 calorie back out. If we can figure out how to turn soy directly into something that the consumer can't distinguish from animal meat, that'll be a much healthier way to get our protein, and also far more efficient. So you look at something like in 2010, we were feeding about 750 million metric tons of corn and wheat to farm animals, to chickens and pigs and other farm animals. 10 years later, it was more than 1 billion metric tons, as well as another 270 million metric tons of soy. So you referenced the famine, you referenced the war in Ukraine, and 50 million metric tons of wheat displaced by that war, and it puts the prospect of famine on front pages all over the world. 25 times that many crops are fed every single year to chickens and pigs and other farm animals. It's a system that contributes to global poverty, global food insecurity. And if we're going to produce twice as many animals by 2050, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. So we need a solution that solves for that. Plant-based and cultivated meat solve for that.
Right. Yes. I think the aspect of resource inefficiencies with animal agriculture is quite clear with the mountain of evidence that we do have from the likes of World Resources Institute, UNFAO, and a number of other intergovernmental organizations have done research into this space. That is clear. And I think where you could provide some insight as well is into the future trajectories of these different areas that you mentioned, plant-based meat, potentially made out of soy or other staple crops, your cultivated meat, which is, as you said, indistinguishable from regular meat, as well as precision fermented dairy. What do you see for the future outlooks of these 3 different products within this alternative protein sector?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vivek. And let me just take a step back and say, for people who are struggling a little bit with the idea of making meat from plants or cultivating actual animal meat directly from cells, this really is the food industry's response, or the food industry version of renewable energy and electric vehicles. So with renewable energy, there is a recognition that every single year, at least through 2050, global energy consumption is going to go up. So for people who care about the climate and what fossil fuels are doing to the climate, obviously we want more energy efficient buildings. Obviously we want more energy efficient light bulbs. We want to conserve energy. But at the end of the day, we absolutely need renewables as an alternative to fossil fuels. The same basic point is true with electric vehicles. 100% of economists agree there will be more energy produced through 2050. There will be more cars produced and more miles driven as the world develops. That's just what's going to happen as population grows and the world develops. So we definitely want to work toward more walkable cities. We want to encourage people to ride bikes. We want better public transportation. But at the end of the day, we need electric vehicles if we want to get off of gas-powered cars. Same thing here. There are a lot of food solutions in agriculture, all of them that actually mitigate climate change and decrease antibiotics use and the rest. We should do them. But at the end of the day, the solution that actually replaces the products of industrial animal agriculture with products that cause a fraction of the climate change and don't cause the global health harms, that is making meat from plants, and that is cultivating actual animal meat directly from cells, and that's going to be a big part of the solution.
Right, right. Thank you for your insightful answer, Bruce. And I think, as you know as well, there are a number of key actors in the field making this happen, such as alternative protein firms. You have established meat and dairy, governments, VCs, and institutional investors. So I'm wondering, where does GFI come into this? What role does it play in bridging the knowledge gap and providing finance alongside these other actors?
Yeah, so GFI is basically a science think tank. So we have just north of 200 full-time staff. GFI is actually a network of nonprofits. So we've got GFI in the US, but we also have GFI India, GFI Israel, GFI Brazil, GFI Asia Pacific, which is based out of Singapore, and GFI Europe. So we have a team in Brussels looking at the European Union, and we have a team in the UK. And the plurality of GFI's team members are scientists. The goal is scientific ecosystem building. And then our global battle cry, the number one goal of all of the 6 GFI NGOs, is to convince governments to help alternative proteins succeed. And they do that in 2 ways. One, funding open access science. So funding the foundational science that will help all of the players across the industry to be successful. And then the other half of it is private sector incentives, and that's private sector incentives for research, but also, and even more importantly, private sector incentives for infrastructure and manufacturing build out. So you look at something like Tesla would have failed at least once, probably twice, if not for government-backed loans. Those are the sorts of things that have allowed renewable energy companies to succeed and EV companies to succeed. We need those same sorts of private sector incentives and those same sorts of research incentives to ensure that alternative proteins succeed. So that's GFI's global battle cry. The third pillar, so everything that GFI does, we use the OKR system popularized by Google. So we have objectives, we have key results, and we have 3 programmatic areas. The first one is science. That's the plurality of our team members, and we're a scientific think tank. The second one is policy. That's our global battle cry, convincing governments that they should incentivize this sector in the same way that they incentivize other sectors. And then the third pillar is industry. And GFI does everything from helping startups to understand what the white spaces are, to helping investors understand how to evaluate startups and understand the sector better, all the way up to having relationships with the biggest food and meat companies in the world to help them understand the sector and take advantage of their sort of natural capacity to understand what it means to feed billions of people. And we have lots and lots of resources. We have newsletters. We have a monthly business of alt protein webinar, a monthly science of alt protein webinar, and lots of sort of webinars that come along as we're producing various reports. So folks can find out about all of it at gfi.org.
Fantastic, Bruce. And on the topic of scalability, I think we have gone quite deeply into the great potential that's there with alternative proteins, but I think maybe it would be worth also looking at potential drawbacks and how these can be addressed. So on scalability, many experts in the field, such as Adam Bergman, head of AgTech investment banking at Citi, have commented on the issue of cost-effective scalability. And alongside scalability, there have been doubts that have been raised on technological innovation and promoting greater accessibility of alternative proteins. How much of a concern is this to you? And do you think GFI's role in acting as a pillar to influence policy decisions and incentivize alternative proteins, would that be enough to overcome this challenge of technological innovation, scalability, and ultimately promoting the accessibility of alternative proteins?
Yeah, I mean that's our global battle cry right there, Vivek. Is figuring out how to get over the what companies call the valley of death, and that has to do with the fact that venture capital funds will fund the early science, and then once you're over the valley of death and you're producing at scale, that's where you get to the accessibility that you were just describing. And in between is you need to build $150 million factories. And venture capital doesn't want to fund $150 million factories. And if you are a new company, you probably don't qualify for a standard loan. This was what befell Tesla, and the Department of Energy stepped in and made a loan that they paid back early. So those are the sorts of incentives that we absolutely are going to need to see from governments in order for this industry to succeed. We're super optimistic that it's going to happen. So we've just seen a lot of sort of third-party think tank reports, including one from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is one of the foremost think tanks in the world. And they produced a 4,900-word report that basically called on the U.S. government to prioritize alternative proteins. And they focused on economic competitiveness. They focused on food systems resilience. And basically, they said, like any other sort of new industry, whether you're talking about computer chips or lithium-ion batteries or kind of anything else, the governments that incentivize these industries will be the governments that win in the marketplace. So you look at something like lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. China has 95 gigafactories producing lithium-ion batteries. The United States has 4. All of Europe has 10. There's a similar story to be told with solar panels. So our pitch to governments is this is going to be a $700 billion to $1.1 trillion industry, according to economic modeling done by McKinsey's Vivid Economics. It's going to create somewhere on the order of 83 million jobs. And as the Center for Strategic and International Studies says, this is something that government should be incentivizing so that they can take advantage of those jobs and take advantage of that economic activity. And also, we believe that without alternative proteins, there's a very strong case to be made that Paris climate goals are going to be impossible. So there's a lot of incentive for governments to lean in, and that's what we're working to make happen.
Right. That's amazing, Bruce. And I think we are also seeing the effects of those incentives on countries who are taking them up and who are actively promoting them. I mean, here from the context in Singapore, Singapore has also launched its various public-private partnerships in the area of alternative proteins. You have Narasa, you have Scale Up Bio, an alternative proteins accelerator, and I think you are really seeing how that has put the country at the forefront of this new revolution, so to speak. And I think another area that we should probably cover is the issue of public sentiment to do with alternative proteins. That is also another barrier to overcome on the demand side, as we've kind of discussed how GFI is helping solve these issues on supply side. So I think maybe I'll start with connecting the dots to GMO. Historically, we have seen mixed public sentiment and at times hard opposition to genetically modified crops. Obviously, those are separate to alternative proteins. But given this consumer skepticism towards GMO products, could we expect similar hesitancy concerning the health credentials of alternative proteins as the space continues to evolve? And how does GFI plan on addressing that kind of demand gap?
I think on the cultivated meat side, almost certainly no. On the cultivated meat side, early on, we'll certainly see that. But there is going to be such limited supply that there will be, they will not be able, there will be far more people wanting to buy cultivated meat than there is cultivated meat supply for at least a couple of years. So, maybe some portion of the population is not going to want to consume it, but enough people are going to be enthusiastic about it that those people will be sort of irrelevant in the marketplace. As cultivated meat, as more and more people are consuming it and it becomes normalized, suddenly you've got a case where you've got two products that are biologically identical, except one of them, if it's seafood, has dioxins and mercury in it from the waters that the animals are swimming in, and the other doesn't. Or if it's land animals, one of them has antibiotics and E. coli and Campylobacter, and the other doesn't. So once we are able to get those to price parity, it's just inconceivable to me that people are going to want to pay extra for poisoned mercury poisoned fish or antibiotic laden chicken. They'll go with the cultivated product. It's a very different story on the plant-based side. And it's just really tough to know what the ceiling is going to be for plant-based once we hit price and taste parity. One can easily imagine a scenario in which people are super enthusiastic about the lower fat and saturated fat levels, enthusiastic about the lack of cholesterol, enthusiastic about the fact that they're getting some fiber and some complex carbohydrates. So the macronutrient analysis is so much better for plant-based meat relative to animal-based meat. Probably a lot of people, once the products taste identical and the plant-based products cost less, will switch. But there certainly is a significant portion of the population that, I don't know if it's psychology or physiology or what, but really wants to eat animal meat. And what percentage that is going to be, I think is really anybody's guess. But I think we will be able to sell a lot more plant-based meat than we're selling now once the products are at price and taste parity.
Right. That's great, Bruce. And I think that kind of segues quite well into my next question, which is going to be on the revolution that we're seeing in this space. We're seeing so much demand for these new products, these new cultivated meat products, and a lot of buzz in this space as well. Quoting GFI analysis, alt protein investment currently stands at over a whopping $14 billion, and that has been nearly doubling year on year over the past decade. There's been a lot of talk with the US FDA's recently regulatory approval for the sale of cultivated meat, making the US the second country to do so. What do you think this means for global food systems, and which regions do you think might follow suit in the future? We are hearing quite a bit from Europe with, I believe, Aleph Farms in Switzerland, but I'd like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. Singapore in December of 2020 was the first country to grant food safety regulatory approval to cultivated meat. 2.5 years later, the US did it with two companies, both Good Meat, which was already selling in Singapore, as well as Upside Foods. And that is FDA approval and USDA approval, which is pretty exciting. Our expectation is that you'll see a small handful of countries follow the US's and Singapore's lead. I expect Israel won't be too far off. Japan and Korea won't be too far off. The UK won't be too far off. Switzerland is a little less clear, but might not be too far off. So I think we're gonna see a lot of approvals of this new and improved way of making meat. And those are some of the regions that we would expect to be seen coming along. There may be a dark horse in there. There may be some other countries I didn't just predict that are wanting to get in on the action as well. But those are probably those are some of the safe bets.
Right. Yeah, that's very promising, Bruce. And you mentioned many countries who kind of have the capacity to go into this revolution. Obviously, GFI has been helping influence policy and help to bridge this knowledge gap. But I guess it leaves me wondering, how do we empower, or how does the global South empower similar transitions in alternative proteins? Is it a capacity issue? Is it a policy issue? What angle do you see could be improved?
Yeah, I mean, just stepping back for a second, and I suppose this is almost tautological, but the global populations that benefit the most from a transition to alternative proteins are those in the global south for whom land pressures from animal agriculture, which we've been talking about, they're forcing pastoralists and smallholder farmers off their land. They're pushing subsistence fishers off of waters as they see their catches vanish. Obviously, the people who did the least to contribute to climate change are the people who are most adversely impacted by climate change. Things like antimicrobial resistance, making antibiotics no longer work. That's basically the end of modern medicine. That's pretty bad in developed economies. It's life and death for millions and millions and millions of people. I'm sorry, that's bad for developed economies. It's life and death for people in developing economies. You look at something like COVID-19 was not a particularly deadly pandemic relative to what could have happened. It was not a particularly transmissible pandemic relative to what could have happened. And yet it sent more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. It set poverty alleviation efforts back probably 10 years. So alternative proteins are a big part of the solution to all of those harms, and consequently are going to be most advantageous. The benefits are going to be most advantageous for people in the global south. There are also direct intervention aspects of this in the global south. There's some really interesting work that's being done with biomass fermentation in Africa. There's interesting work that's being done with cultivated meat in India. Brazil is doing both plant-based and cultivated meat. Their government is very enthusiastic about both technologies, as is the corporate sector in Brazil. So there's sort of the direct alternative protein intervention in significant portions of the global south. And then there's just the fact that the external costs of industrial animal agriculture that are most alleviated by this shift are also most harmful to global south countries.
Right. Thanks for clarifying that perspective, Bruce. And I myself didn't know much about these implementations and interventions that have already happened. And it's great to learn a bit more about that. And I think it's time for me to read up a bit more on that, as there's still more for a lot of us to learn. And I think that's really a great way to end off. And I want to thank you once again, Bruce, for your enlightening answers and detailed insight. And I think it's safe to say that this has been an incredible discussion on the role of alternative proteins and its ever-evolving presence on the global stage and also in global food systems. And despite some hurdles, this field does look incredibly promising for areas of food security, climate change, and animal welfare. And GFI's work to help bridge we spoke about this, the supply gap primarily. I think that's been incredible and will really catapult the revolution right ahead. And it's definitely an exciting time to be in, Bruce. And with that, this brings today's episode to a close. So thank you everyone for watching and stay tuned.